March 15th, 1938. The day Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation, 10-year-old. Thomas Schneider pressed his face against the cold window of his family's apartment, overlooking Vienna's Ringstrasse. Watching German tanks roll through streets that had been his entire world, he could not have known that within 18 months he would be one of the lucky ones, clutching a single suitcase on a train carrying him away from everything he had ever loved, part of a desperate rescue mission that would save nearly 10,000 children from certain death. The Anschluss transformed Vienna overnight. Thomas's father, a respected physician, lost his hospital position within weeks. His mother's jewelry disappeared, traded for bread and hope. The yellow stars came next, marking them as targets in their own city. But amid the darkness, a flicker of light emerged from an unlikely source. Britain opened its doors not to families, but to their children. The Kindertransport, as historians would later call it, according to records preserved by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, represented one of humanity's most bittersweet rescue operations. Between December 1938 and September 1939, trains carried unaccompanied Jewish children from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland to safety in Britain. Parents faced an impossible choice: keep their children close and risk everything, or send them alone into an unknown future, trusting strangers in a foreign land. Thomas's mother spent 3 weeks securing his place on the transport. She sewed British currency into the lining of his coat, packed photographs she prayed he would not forget, and wrote his name in careful English letters on a cardboard tag tied around his neck. On the morning of June 2, 1939, she walked him to the West Banff station, her hand trembling in his. The platform churned with chaos, hundreds of children, some as young as 3, crying for parents who fought to maintain composure. Nazi officials shouted orders, inspecting papers with cruel efficiency. Thomas's mother knelt before him, straightening his collar one final time. "Be good," she whispered in German, or in English. "We'll come for you soon." They both knew it was a lie told from love. The train lurched forward at precisely 11 in the morning. Thomas watched his mother shrink into the distance, her hand raised in farewell until she became a speck, then nothing. Around him, children sobbed. A girl no older than 5 screamed for her papa. Teenage volunteers moved through the cars, distributing sandwiches no one could eat. The journey took 3 days: Vienna to Berlin, Berlin to the Hook of Holland, then across the Channel to Harwich. At the Dutch border, Nazi guards conducted final inspections, their boots heavy on the train floor, their eyes searching for contraband or hidden adults. One guard confiscated Thomas's father's pocket watch, the only thing of value he carried. Thomas said nothing, remembering his mother's warning. Silence keeps you safe. When the train finally crossed into free territory, something shifted. The air itself seemed different. Thomas fell asleep somewhere over the North Sea and woke to British voices calling, "Welcome, children. You're safe now," but safety, he would soon learn, came with its own complicated price. June 5th, 1939, marked Thomas Schneider's first morning on British soil. Though morning felt wrong, everything felt wrong in this place where people spoke incomprehensible words and ate beans for breakfast. He stood with 43 other bewildered children in a drafty hall in London's Bloomsbury district, each clutching their pathetic suitcase, waiting to be chosen like puppies in a shop window. The selection process, documented extensively in the Association of Jewish Refugees archives, operated with uncomfortable efficiency. British families arrived throughout the day, inspecting the refugee children with varying degrees of warmth. Some came from genuine compassion, others seeking household help disguised as charity, still others motivated by religious duty or social pressure. Thomas watched younger children selected first. They were easier, more moldable, less likely to remember. By evening, only 7 children remained. Thomas among them, too old to be cute, too young to be useful. A tall woman in a practical wool coat approached him, her face angular and unsmiling. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley introduced herself in crisp English he could not understand, examined his tag, and nodded once. "You'll do," she said, though Thomas would not comprehend those words for months. Mrs. Hartley lived in a village called Dorset, hours from London by train. Her husband had died in the Great War, leaving her a large house, modest income, and no children of her own. Neither was not unkind, but neither was she warm. Thomas had his own room, a luxury he only later appreciated, but meals were silent affairs, and physical affection did not exist in her emotional vocabulary. The other refugee children scattered across Britain faced dramatically different fates, according to research published by the Imperial War Museum. Some landed in loving homes where foster parents learned German phrases and celebrated Jewish holidays. Others ended up as servants, scrubbing floors and minding children while their education evaporated. Many experienced both extremes, shuffled between families as circumstances changed. Rachel Friedman, who had traveled on the same transport as Thomas, found herself in Manchester with a Quaker family named Morrison. They enrolled her in school immediately, helped her write letters home, and treated her as their own daughter. Years later, she would describe them as her second parents, the people who taught her that goodness existed even in darkness. But 12-year-old Jacob Stein was not so fortunate. His placement in rural Scotland ended after 6 months, when his foster family could no longer afford an extra mouth to feed. He moved to a hostel in Glasgow, then to another family, then another. By 1942, he had lived in 7 different homes. Each move carved away another piece of his identity, until he barely remembered the boy who had boarded the train in Berlin. Thomas's experience fell somewhere between these extremes. Mrs. Hartley insisted he speak only English. "You're in Britain now," which severed his connection to his mother tongue, even as it opened doors. She enrolled him in the village school, where classmates alternated between curiosity and cruelty, calling him Jerry and Nazi boy, despite his Jewish refugee status. The British children could not distinguish between German and Jewish, enemy and victim. At night, Thomas wrote letters to his parents in careful German script, describing his new life in optimistic terms he did not feel. For months, responses arrived regularly, his mother's handwriting growing more cramped. His father's messages shorter. They had moved to a smaller apartment. His father was doing odd jobs. They were managing and hoping to join him soon. Then, in September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and the letters stopped. September 3, 1939, began as an ordinary Sunday in Dorset. Thomas Schneider woke to church bells, a sound he had learned meant the village would empty for morning services, leaving him alone with Mrs. Hartley's silent disapproval of his Jewish refusal to attend. But these bells rang differently, urgent and discordant, and by noon, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice crackled through Mrs. Hartley's wireless, declaring that Britain and Germany were at war. Thomas understood enough English by then to comprehend the essential truth. The country that had saved him was now fighting the country holding his parents. He became, overnight, an enemy alien living in enemy territory. Though which enemy he represented remained deliberately vague. The British government's response to its refugee children proved paradoxically protective and suspicious, according to documentation preserved by the Wiener Holocaust Library. Most Kindertransport children were classified as friendly enemy aliens, a bureaucratic contradiction that captured their impossible position. They required monitoring, but not internment, protection, but not full trust. Thomas received an identity card he had to carry everywhere, and Mrs. Hartley had to report his presence to local authorities monthly. His letters to Vienna continued. He wrote every week, filling pages with increasingly desperate questions. Where were they living? Did they have enough food? When would they come? He addressed them carefully, walked them to the post office himself, and waited. For 6 weeks, nothing. Then 3 letters arrived simultaneously, all dated before the war began, his mother's handwriting barely legible. "We are trying, Liebschon. Be patient. Be good." After that, silence. Other Kindertransport children across Britain experienced the same agonizing void. Mail service between warring nations evaporated. The International Red Cross established a message service allowing 25-word communications, but even these grew sporadic. Parents who had been real people with voices and embraces became abstractions, fading memories that grew hazier with each passing month. Rachel Friedman's foster family in Manchester held her while she sobbed after her Red Cross message went unanswered. They took her to a rabbi who explained, gently, that silence did not mean death. Communications were simply impossible. But in his eyes, Rachel saw a truth he would not speak. Silence probably did mean death, or something close to it. By 1941, whispers circulated through refugee networks about deportations, ghettos, camps. The word extermination had not yet entered common vocabulary. but children who had escaped Austria and Germany shared fragmented information from relatives in neutral countries. Thomas learned his former neighbors in Vienna had been sent east, a direction that sounded like a place. It felt like an ending. Mrs. Hartley, to her credit, allowed Thomas's grief without comment. She did not offer comfort that was not her nature, but she stopped complaining when he left his bedroom light burning all night. Unable to sleep in darkness that felt too much like forgetting. She began serving meals he recognized from Vienna: schnitzel, apple strudel. Small gestures from a woman who showed love through action rather than words. The war years transformed Britain's landscape and Thomas's childhood simultaneously. Air raid sirens became routine. Rationing meant creativity with turnips and powdered eggs. The village school lost male teachers to military service, replaced by elderly retirees and stern women who taught with increasing urgency, as if education itself was an act of defiance. Thomas threw himself into studies with ferocious determination. Mathematics became his refuge. Problems had solutions. Equations balanced, theorems proved themselves true regardless of human cruelty. His German accent faded, replaced by the soft Dorset burr of his classmates. He learned to drink tea with milk, play cricket awkwardly, and laugh at jokes about Hitler that made him flinch internally. He was becoming British, even as the part of him that was Austrian disappeared like morning fog. January 1942 brought unusual snow to southern England, and with it, a letter that changed Thomas Schneider's trajectory. The envelope bore an official stamp from the Jewish Refugees Committee in London, informing Mrs. Hartley that Thomas, now 14, had been selected for transfer to a hostel in the capital, specifically for refugee children. The letter emphasized educational opportunities and community support, though its true purpose remained unspoken. Britain's foster families, strained by years of war and rationing, were returning their refugee children. Mrs. Hartley read the letter twice over breakfast, her face revealing nothing. "They think you do better with your own kind," she said finally. Thomas felt simultaneous relief and abandonment. He had never loved Mrs. Hartley, but she represented stability in a disintegrating world. Now even that fragile foundation was crumbling. The hostel occupied a requisitioned townhouse in Hampstead, managed by refugee aid organizations documented extensively by the Central British Fund for Jewish Relief. 42 children aged 12 to 18 lived there, German, Austrian, Polish, Chakal, carrying the same unspoken burden of disappeared parents. They spoke English to each other now, having learned that German attracted suspicion and triggered memories better left dormant. Here, Thomas met others whose experiences made his own seem almost fortunate. Joseph Kaufmann had been 9 when his parents placed him on a Kindertransport from Prague in March 1939, weeks before the Nazis closed Czechoslovakia's borders. Unlike Thomas, Joseph remembered his parents vividly, his father's deep laugh, his mother's Friday evening candles. He kept their final letter under his pillow, the paper disintegrating from constant handling. Ruth Levy arrived at the hostel from Manchester after her foster family's home was destroyed in the Christmas Blitz of 1940. She had lost everything except the clothes she wore, photographs, letters, the last tangible connections to her Berlin childhood. At 16, she moved through the world with the exhausted pragmatism of someone twice her age. The hostel's warden, Mr. Ezra Goldstein, had himself fled Germany in 1933, early enough to bring his family intact. He understood his charge's peculiar grief, not the clean sorrow of known death, but the suffocating uncertainty of probably death, the hope that poisoned healing. He ran the hostel with structured compassion, mandatory schooling, voluntary religious services, an absolute prohibition on asking about parents. According to records maintained by the Association of Jewish Refugees, dozens of such hostels operated across Britain during the war years. They became surrogate families, creating culture from shared trauma. The children taught each other survival skills, how to forge English roots on Austrian foundations, how to honor disappeared families without drowning in absence, how to build futures on graves they could not visit. Thomas flourished academically in this environment, surrounded by peers who spoke multiple languages and valued education as existential defiance. He devoured mathematics and physics. A teacher named Dr. Walter Klein himself, a refugee physicist from Vienna, recognized Thomas's talent and tutored him privately, preparing him for university examinations typically taken years later. But education could not fill the void. In the hostel's common room, children gathered around the wireless every evening, listening to BBC broadcasts about the war's progress. They charted Allied advances with desperate mathematics. If the Soviets reached Warsaw by spring? If the Americans invaded Italy by summer? If the British bombed rail lines into Poland then? Perhaps. Possibly, maybe their families would survive. News was scarce, but rumors flourished. Someone's cousin in Switzerland heard from someone in Budapest that the camps were labor facilities, brutal but survivable. Another story whispered through refugee networks spoke of mass shootings in Ukrainian forests. A girl from Hamburg claimed her aunt escaped to Shanghai and confirmed terrible things without specification. The phrase "final solution" did not reach British ears until much later. But the children in the Hampstead hostel understood before the words existed. They read between lines in Red Cross reports, decoded euphemisms in diplomatic communications, and recognized the silence of absent letters as its own form of testimony. In May 1943, Thomas turned 15. Mr. Goldstein organized a small celebration, a cake made from hoarded rations, singing in multiple languages. Joseph gave him a chess set carved from scrap wood. Ruth wrote him a poem in German, then translated it to English, apologizing that some meanings could not survive translation. That night, Thomas lay awake, calculating probabilities he would never speak aloud, the likelihood his parents had survived 3 years under Nazi occupation, the chances they were still in Vienna versus deported east, the statistical reality that their silence meant precisely what he refused to believe. Mathematics offered no comfort, but at least equations did not lie. May 8, 1945 erupted across London with church bells, air raid sirens wailing in celebration rather than warning, and crowds pouring into streets to mark Victory in Europe Day. Thomas Schneider, now 17, stood in Trafalgar Square among thousands of jubilant Britons. Watching strangers embrace and sailors kiss girls beneath Nelson's column, the war was over. The Nazis had surrendered. Europe was free. Felt nothing. Around him, fellow Kindertransport refugees wore similar expressions of muted confusion. This moment should have meant reunion, parents emerging from hiding or camps to reclaim their children, families restored. Instead, it marked the beginning of terrible knowledge, the transition from uncertainty to confirmation, from hope to grief. The British government, in coordination with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, according to documents housed at the National Archives, immediately began compiling survivor lists. Names trickled in from liberated camps, Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. Refugee organizations posted lists in their offices, updated weekly. Children whose parents appeared on these lists experienced grim relief. Alive meant traumatized and diminished, but alive. Thomas visited the Jewish Refugees Committee office every Friday after his classes at the Polytechnic where Dr. Klein had secured his placement. He scanned lists alphabetically, searching Schneider, Bernard, Schneider, Eva. The names never appeared. Week after week, month after month, he stood in that cramped office with dozens of other refugees, all performing the same ritual of desperate hope. Ruth Levy found her mother's name in July 1945 on a survivor list from their Zienstadt concentration camp. She traveled to Southampton to meet the ship bringing survivors to Britain. Standing among hundreds on the dock, scanning skeletal figures for familiar features. When they finally embraced, Ruth later told Thomas she barely recognized the woman who was somehow still her mother. The camps had stolen 40 pounds from her frame and decades from her face. Joseph Kaufman was not so fortunate. In September 1945, the Red Cross confirmed what he had known without acknowledgement for years. His parents had been murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. The documentation was precise. Transport date, arrival date, selection for immediate gassing. His father had been 43, his mother 41. They had survived 3 years under occupation before their deportation. Then approximately 3 hours after arriving in Poland, the hostel in Hampstead became simultaneously emptier and more crowded as the truth crystallized. A handful of children reunited with surviving parents or relatives, packing their meager belongings with bittersweet joy. But most, like Thomas and Joseph, faced confirmation that they were orphans, a word that seemed inadequate for the specific nature of their loss. According to research published by the Imperial War Museum, of the nearly 10,000 children who arrived in Britain through the Kinder transport, Only about 1,000 ever reunited with their parents. The others 9,000 children learned through official channels or devastating silence that their families had been murdered in the systematic genocide that would come to be called the Holocaust. Mr. Goldstein organized support groups, hiring a psychologist who specialized in refugee trauma, Dr. Margaret Sutherland, Quaker woman with gentle persistence. Encouraged the orphaned children to speak about their parents in present tense, to maintain memory as a form of resistance against erasure. They existed, she insisted. Their lives had meaning beyond their deaths. Thomas struggled with this framework. His parents existed now only in his increasingly unreliable memory, his mother's face blurring at the edges, his father's voice indistinguishable from other half-remembered German conversations. He had photographs, but they felt like evidence of strangers. These people in formal poses bore little resemblance to the living, breathing parents who had kissed him goodbye in June 19th. In December 1945, Mr. Goldstein gathered all the hostel residents for a meeting. The Jewish Refugees Committee, he explained, secured funding to help orphaned kinder transport children pursue higher education, vocational training, or immigration to Palestine. They were no longer charity cases awaiting family reunion. They were young adults who needed to build futures from the wreckage of their pasts. Thomas chose university. His mathematical aptitude had only strengthened, and Dr. Klein believed he could secure admission to Cambridge to study physics. The idea of Cambridge and Chinchin colleges, Nobel laureates, centuries of scholarships seemed simultaneously absurd and inevitable. A boy who once wore a yellow star in Vienna, attending one of the world's great universities. But first, he needed closure. March 1946 found Thomas Schneider aboard a military transport bound for Vienna, part of a Red Cross delegation helping refugees search for surviving family members and reclaim property. He was 18 now, tall and angular, his Viennese accent buried beneath layers of English boarding school diction. He had not spoken German regularly in 6 years. The language felt foreign in his mouth, borrowed clothes that no longer fit properly. The city he remembered no longer existed. Allied bombing and Soviet artillery had reduced whole neighborhoods to rubble. The Ringstrasse, where he had watched Nazi tanks parade in 1938, was pocked with craters. His family's apartment building still stood, but shells had blown out the top floors, leaving the structure gutted and listing. Thomas stood outside for nearly an hour before entering. Different names appeared on the mailboxes, now Austrian families who had moved into confiscated Jewish apartments during the war, or opportunists who claimed abandoned properties after liberation. The cultural looting documentation efforts by the monuments men would later reveal how thoroughly he climbed to the 4th floor where his family had lived. The door was painted different colors, the mezuzah long gone. He knocked, heard shuffling inside, and a middle-aged woman answered. She looked at him with immediate suspicion. Everyone looked at everyone with suspicion in post-war Vienna. "I lived here before the war," Thomas explained in rusty German. "My family, the Schneiders. I wondered if you might have any information about what happened to them." The woman's face hardened. "We bought this apartment legally," she said defensively, "from the city. We have papers." "I'm not trying to reclaim anything," Thomas assured her, though he was not entirely certain this was true. "I just want to know what happened." She softened slightly, perhaps recognizing genuine grief beneath his careful English suit. "The Jewish families all left," she said, using the Nazi euphemism that made deportation sound voluntary. "Some went east. We don't know details. There was a war, you understand. Everyone suffered." This last phrase would become grimly familiar to Thomas over the following weeks. Everyone suffered. Austrians positioned themselves as victims of German occupation, conveniently forgetting their enthusiastic cheering when Hitler entered Vienna, their eager participation in Aryanization of Jewish businesses, their willingness to turn neighbors over to authorities. The documentation efforts by the newly established Jewish community organizations, according to records maintained by the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, faced systematic obstruction. Property records had mysteriously disappeared. Neighbors claimed ignorance. Austrian authorities prioritized reconciliation over accountability, treating Jewish survivors as inconvenient reminders rather than citizens owed restitution. Thomas spent 3 weeks in Vienna, visiting government offices that provided frustrating circularity. His parents' names appeared on deportation lists: Bernard and Eva Schneider. Transport dated October 1942, destination Dersenstadt. From there, prisoners were sent to Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. The Nazis had destroyed most records during their retreat, leaving gaps that grief filled with terrible imagination. He visited the Jewish Community Center, where survivors gathered daily, posting photographs of missing relatives and sharing fragmented information. An elderly man recognized his father's name. They had worked together briefly in a forced labor battalion before Bernard's deportation. He was a good man, the survivor said, as if goodness had been protection. On his final day in Vienna, Thomas walked to the central cemetery, where Vienna's Jewish section contained memorials for those who had no graves. He found no stone for his parents, too many dead to memorialize individually, but stood among thousands of similar mourners, all performing the same ritual of grieving the unburied. A young woman stood nearby, crying silently. She could not have been older than 20, wearing a dress too large for her thin frame. Thomas recognized the posture of another Kindertransport survivor, returning home to emptiness. "I'm Rachel," she said when their eyes met. Rachel Friedman. "I was in Manchester during the war." Thomas remembered her, the girl with the kind Quaker family. "Did your family ... She shook her head. "My parents died in Auschwitz, 1943. My brother survived Buchenwald, but he's in a sanatorium in Switzerland, tuberculosis. The doctors think he might recover, but ... She trailed off, and Thomas understood. Recovery was relative. No one truly recovered from this. They walked together through Vienna's ruined streets, two ghosts visiting a city that had erased them. They stopped at a cafe that somehow still operated amid the rubble, serving weak coffee and stale bread. A violinist played Strauss in the corner, pretending Vienna was still the elegant imperial capital it had once been. "Are you going back to England?" Rachel asked. "Cambridge? I have a place to study physics this autumn." "I'm going to Palestine," she said. "There's nothing left for me here. I need to go somewhere I can be Jewish without apologizing for surviving." Thomas understood, though his path diverged. Britain had saved him, educated him, given him a future. It was also the place where he had become someone his parents would not recognize in manner and speech, disconnected from the Vienna of his childhood. They parted at the train station with promises to write, promises they would partially keep. October 1946 marked Thomas Schneider's arrival at Cambridge University, where he became one of dozens of refugee students scattered across ancient colleges, studying everything from medicine to philosophy. Trinity College, where he had secured a place to study physics, had survived the war physically intact, its Gothic spires and manicured courts unchanged since Newton walked there centuries earlier. This permanence felt both comforting and alienating to someone whose entire childhood geography had been destroyed. Professor James Hartwell, who would become Thomas's academic supervisor, greeted him with characteristic British understatement. "Schneider, yes, you're the chap from Vienna. Good Klein speaks highly of your mathematical ability. Let's see if he's right, shall we?" No mention of the war, displacement, or loss exactly the emotional distance Thomas needed to function. Cambridge's rigid structure provided unexpected therapy. Morning lectures, afternoon problem sets, evening supervisions. The academic machinery demanded intellectual engagement that left little energy for existential despair. Thomas threw himself into quantum mechanics and electromagnetic theory with monastic dedication, sleeping for hours nightly, filling notebooks with equations that explained how the universe operated at its smallest scales. According to documentation held by Cambridge University archives, the university admitted approximately 200 refugee students between 1946 and 1950, most on scholarships funded by refugee aid organizations or sympathetic donors. They formed an unofficial community, recognizing each other by certain markers: over-formal English, fierce work ethic, tendency to hoard food from dining halls, nightmares that interrupted library study sessions. Joseph Kaufman, Thomas's friend from the Hampstead Hostel, had secured a place at the London School of Economics to study international relations. They maintained correspondence, letters debating whether to anglicize their names. Joseph considered Joseph. Thomas contemplated Tom, and whether doing so represented pragmatic adaptation or self-erasure. Neither committed fully. They introduced themselves as Joseph and Thomas, but did not correct English acquaintances who called them Joseph and Tom. Ruth Friedman wrote occasionally from Palestine, where she had joined a kibbutz near Haifa. Her letters described physical labor that exhausted thought, communal living that replaced lost family, and the strange experience of being surrounded by Jews who had survived or never face the Nazi genocide. Here, being Jewish is normal, she wrote. I'm still adjusting to normal. Life in post-war Britain operated under continued rationing and rebuilding, documented extensively by the Imperial War Museum's social history collections. Meat remained scarce until 1954, bread rationed until 1948. Cambridge students subsisted on institutional meals of dubious nutrition, supplemented by care packages from families' packages refugee students did not receive. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, Thomas's former foster mother, sent a letter during his first term. Her handwriting neat and angular as her personality conveyed stilted affection, she hoped he was applying himself, eating properly, and remembering his manners. She enclosed 5 pounds, a substantial sum she could barely afford, with instructions to buy something practical. Thomas bought books, as she surely knew he would. In the summer of 1947, Thomas took employment at a physics laboratory in Manchester, assisting with early research into particle detection. The work was tedious and poorly paid, but it kept him in Britain during the vacation period, when his lack of family home became conspicuous. Other students returned to parents and siblings. Thomas returned to rented rooms and laboratory benches. Manchester brought him back into contact with Rachel Friedman's former foster family, the Morrisons. They invited him for Sabbath dinner, finesse that pierced his careful emotional armor. Mrs. Morrison served Chalonot authentic, close enough to trigger memory on blessed candles, while Mr. Morrison, a Quaker, sat respectfully silent. They asked careful questions about his studies, his plans, his well-being. They did not ask about his parents. Rachel writes that you're doing brilliantly at Cambridge, Mrs. Morrison said, serving soup. Her letters from Palestine sound hopeful. I think the kibbutz is good for her. Thomas nodded, uncertain how to explain that good had become a relative term. Rachel was alive, employed, safe, that constituted success, given the alternative. And you? Mr. Morrison asked. Are you finding your way? The question was more profound than he intended. Thomas was finding a way through physics and mathematics, through the quantifiable universe that operated by laws immune to human cruelty. Whether it was his way remained unclear. He graduated in 1949 with first-class honors, his dissertation on quantum field theory earning rare praise from Professor Hartwell. Exceptional work, Schneider. You should pursue a doctorate. I can arrange funding. It was the highest compliment the professor offered, delivered with the emotional enthusiasm of reading a train schedule. Thomas accepted, committing to 3 more years at Cambridge. He was 21 years old, an orphan building a life from intellectual rigor and controlled emotional distance. He had survived, which his parents had not. He owed them what? Success? Memory? Happiness? No, the question haunted him more than any nightmare. May 15th. 2014 found Sir Thomas Schneider, and in 1998, for contributions to theoretical physics, standing in London's Imperial War Museum before a new exhibition dedicated to the Kindertransport. At 86, he moved carefully, his body betraying the mathematics that had always sustained his mind. Beside him stood his daughter, Elizabeth, 53, a history professor at Oxford, and his grandson, David, 28, a human rights lawyer who bore an uncanny resemblance to the grandfather he had never met. The exhibition featured photographs of children with cardboard tags, vintage suitcases, yellowed letters. Thomas recognized faces from the Hampstead hostel: Joseph, Ruth, others whose names had faded like the photographs themselves. Panels explained the Kindertransport's history, the 10,000 children saved, the 9,000 orphaned when their parents were murdered in the Holocaust. There's your tag, grandfather, Elizabeth said softly, pointing to a display case containing his original identification card from June 1939. He had donated it years earlier, along with his mother's final letters and his father's confiscated pocket watch, somehow returned decades later through restitution efforts. Thomas stared at the 10-year-old boy in the displayed photograph. Thomas Schneider, Vienna, printed in both German and English. That child seemed like a different person entirely, which in meaningful ways he was. The boy who boarded the train, speaking only German, clutching his mother's hand, could not have imagined the man he would become. A Cambridge physicist, fellow of the Royal Society, professor who trained 3 generations of students, husband to Margaret, deceased 2008, father of 3, grandfather of 7. According to research by the Association of Jewish Refugees, approximately 6,000 Kindertransport survivors were still alive in 2014, scattered across the world. They had become doctors, teachers, artists, scientists, business owners. They had married, raised families, built lives that testified to resilience and survival's complicated inheritance. But all carried the same foundational absence: parents who existed only in diminishing memory. "Did you ever talk to grandmother about your parents?" David asked, studying his great-grandmother's photograph in the display. "Not enough," Thomas admitted. Margaret understood what I couldn't say. She knew silence wasn't the same as forgetting. Margaret, whom he had met in 1953 at a physics conference, had been the daughter of Methodist missionaries. Their children, Elizabeth, Michael, and Robert, grew up knowing they had grandparents who disappeared in the Holocaust. But Thomas struggled to make those grandparents real. To transmit memory he himself was losing. Joseph Kaufman had emigrated to America in 1952, becoming a prominent international relations scholar at Columbia University. They maintained lifelong correspondence, letters evolving from typewritten formality to email casualness, to old men comparing grandchildren and medications. Joseph died in 2011, surrounded by family he had built from nothing. Ruth Friedman stayed in Israel, where she married, raised 4 children, and became a psychologist, specializing in trauma. She pioneered therapeutic approaches for Holocaust survivors and their descendants, understanding intergenerational transmission of trauma long before it became accepted psychology. She died in 2006, her funeral attended by hundreds who credited her with teaching them how to carry grief without drowning in it. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, Thomas's foster mother, lived until 1978. He visited her regularly after settling in England, bringing his wife and children to Dorset, where the awkward woman who had raised him taught his daughters to bake proper English scones. She never said she loved him, but when she died, her will revealed she had kept every letter he ever sent her, tied with a ribbon in a drawer beside her bed. The Kindertransport survivors organized periodic reunions, gatherings that became increasingly important as their numbers dwindled. At these events, documented by various Jewish historical organizations, elderly men and women shared stories they had spent decades suppressing the final moments with parents. The foster family's good and bad, the terrible adjustment of building lives on grief's foundation. "The thing people don't understand," Thomas told an interviewer for the museum's Oral History Project in 2012, "is that we were the lucky ones. We survived. We had opportunities our murdered relatives never got. But survival came with its own burden, the weight of living the lives our parents sacrificed themselves to give us." Standing before the exhibition in 2014, Thomas felt the familiar duality of his existence: gratitude for the life he had built, grief for the life stolen from his parents. Bernard and Eva Schneider, who had died in Auschwitz in October 1942, according to Red Cross documentation, finally confirmed in 1963, never knew their son graduated from Cambridge, became a physicist, married, had children. They died believing, or perhaps knowing, their sacrifice had saved him, but they never saw what that salvation produced. "Tell me about them," David said, his phone ready to record. "Tell me about Bernard and Eva." Thomas closed his eyes, reaching back across 75 years to memories worn smooth by time, his mother's voice singing Viennese lullabies, his father's hands guiding his through arithmetic problems, the smell of their apartment, coffee, books, his mother's perfume, the way they looked at each other when they thought he wasn't watching, love visible in small gestures. "Your great-grandmother Eva was a pianist," Thomas began, his voice steadier than expected. Not professionally, women of her generation rarely had careers, but she played beautifully. She had small hands, but her technique was flawless. She played every evening after dinner, and my father would sit in his chair reading medical journals. But I noticed he always turned the pages in rhythm with her music. Elizabeth squeezed her father's arm, encouraging him to continue. "Bernard, my father, was methodical about everything. He arranged his medical instruments with the precision of a surgeon, though he was a general practitioner. He had that same need to understand how things worked beneath the surface." Thomas opened his eyes, looking at his grandson. "They were ordinary people, David. That's what the Nazis couldn't tolerate, our ordinariness. We were neighbors, colleagues, friends. We shopped at the same markets, attended the same concerts, walked the same streets. Our crime was existing while Jewish? The museum was filling with other visitors, many of them elderly survivors like Thomas, accompanied by children and grandchildren. He recognized a few faces, people he had known 80 years ago, now aged and weathered, but carrying the same unmistakable markers of Kindertransport survivors. They made eye contact, nodded recognition, maintained the respectful distance of people who shared trauma too deep for casual conversation. A museum educator approached their group, introducing herself as Hannah Levy, granddaughter of a Kindertransport survivor. "Sir Thomas, would you be willing to say a few words at today's commemoration ceremony? We have about 70 survivors present, plus family members. It would mean a great deal." Thomas hesitated. He had given countless lectures on physics, had spoken at international conferences, had even delivered a speech when receiving his knighthood. But speaking about this, the raw center of his existence, remained difficult, despite decades of practice. "What would you want me to say?" he asked. "Whatever feels true," Hannah replied simply. An hour later, Thomas stood before a gathered crowd of approximately 300 people in the museum's auditorium. Behind him, a screen displayed a rotating collection of Kindertransport photographs, children with tags. Trains at stations, tearful farewells, British foster families. The images moved with relentless progression, each face representing a story of survival and loss. 75 years ago, Thomas began, his voice amplified through the auditorium. "I stood on a platform in Vienna watching my mother disappear into the distance. I was 10 years old, did not know I would never see her again. If I had known, I'm not certain, could have boarded that train." The room was silent except for the occasional sound of someone crying quietly. "The Kindertransport saved my life. Britain saved my life. The foster families who took us in, however imperfectly, saved our lives. We are the lucky ones, and we have never forgotten that luck was the difference between living and dying. Not virtue, not talent, not worthiness. Luck." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I want to talk about what came after survival. With the children who escaped spent our lives trying to honor the sacrifice our parents made. We became doctors and teachers and scientists and artists. We raised families, contributed to our adopted countries, lived full lives. And yet every achievement has been shadowed by the knowledge that our parents never got to see what their love produced." Elizabeth watched her father from the front row, tears streaming down her face. She had heard fragments of his story throughout her childhood, but he had never spoken this openly, this vulnerably. "My daughter once asked me if I felt guilty for surviving when my parents didn't," Thomas continued. "I told her no, because guilt implies I had agency, choice. But I do feel responsible for living well enough, achieving enough, being happy enough to justify their sacrifice. It's an impossible standard, of course. No amount of success can balance the equation of genocide. But we try anyway, because what else can we do?" He looked out at the audience, seeing elderly survivors nodding in recognition, younger generations struggling to comprehend a trauma they inherited but did not experience. 75 years later, we are dying. The Kindertransport generation is reaching its natural end. Soon there will be no living witnesses to our particular experience, children saved, parents murdered, lives rebuilt on grief's foundation. When we are gone, you," he gestured to the younger people in the audience, "will be the guardians of this memory. Please remember that we were not heroes. We were children who had terrible things happen to us, and we did our best to survive those things. Some of us did better than others. Some of us built beautiful lives. Others were crushed by grief. There is no correct way to survive the unsurvivable." His voice grew stronger. "But also remember that we were more than victims. We were individuals with talents and flaws, successes and failures, joys and sorrows beyond our Holocaust experiences. My mother and father were not just murdered Jews, they were Eva, who played Chopin, and Bernard, who understood medicine as calling. They were people who loved each other, who loved me, who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances." Thomas felt his age acutely, 6 years pressing down the accumulated weight of decades lived in the shadow of absence. "I don't know if there's meaning in survival. I don't know if my life justified my parents' sacrifice. But I know they love me enough to send me away, and I have tried imperfectly, inadequately to honor that love by living as fully as I could manage." He concluded simply, "Remember us, remember them. Remember that genocide targets individuals, not statistics. Every number in 6 million was someone's parent, child, sibling, friend. Every number was a universe of possibility destroyed. The applause that followed was not triumphant, but solemn. A collective acknowledgement of survival's bittersweet triumph. Thomas returned to his seat beside Elizabeth, who embraced him tightly. "Mom would have been proud," she whispered. "Your parents would have been proud." Thomas nodded, though he could never truly believe it. How could pride encompass this survival purchased with their deaths, his life built on their graves? Later that evening, after the ceremonies concluded and the museum emptied, Thomas stood alone before the exhibition one final time. David had offered to wait, but Thomas wanted this moment private. He studied the photographs, the artifacts, the careful documentation of catastrophe and survival. His mother's last letter was displayed behind glass, her handwriting cramped and urgent. "Be good, Liebchen. Learn English. We'll come for you soon." She had known it was a lie, had chosen love over truth in their final communication. Thomas placed his palm against the glass, as close as he could get to touching those words. "I was good, Mama," he whispered in German, the language returning after decades of disuse. "I learned English. I became British. I built a life. I married a wonderful woman who would have loved you. I had 3 children who never got to know you. I have 7 grandchildren who carry your blood but not your memory." He paused, struggling with what he needed to say. "You didn't come for me. I waited, but you didn't come. And I understand why you couldn't. But God, how I wished you could have." The museum guard approached discreetly. "Sir, we're closing soon." Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes. "I'm finished here." But he wasn't, not really. 75 years later, he was still the 10-year-old boy on the platform, still waiting for his mother to come back into focus, still hoping the train might reverse direction and return him to a Vienna that no longer existed. 2 parents who remained forever young in his aging memory. 75 years later, he had survived. It would have to be enough. Outside the museum, London continued its evening routine, buses and taxis, tourists and residents, the ordinary flow of life in a city that had absorbed him, educated him, given him everything except the one thing he had wanted most. Elizabeth and David waited by the entrance. 3 generations of Schneiders who existed because 2 people in Vienna made an impossible choice on a June morning in 1939. "Ready to go home, Dad?" Elizabeth asked gently. Thomas looked back at the museum one final time, then at his daughter and grandson, living testimony that love sometimes survives even when people don't. "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." And they walked together into the London evening, carrying memory forward into a future his parents never saw but had died making possible.